Welcome to another edition in our discussions here on Trinity TV and the ongoing series concerning the implantation of a culture of non-violence. I'm Andy Johnson. In this edition of the program, we look at the issue of non-violence in the media, taking it from the first principle that non-violence begins with me, as always. The question is, how do we employ this in the media? Our guests, Elizabeth Solomon, a journalist who is also an attorney, and who has worked in areas of human rights and of peacemaking as an officer in the United Nations system. She's currently the Executive Director of the Dispute Resolution Center in Trinidad and Tobago. And Kiran Maharaj, Managing Director of Caribbean Lifestyle Communications. She's also President of the Caribbean Media Institute with headquarters in Jamaica, and President of the Trinidad and Tobago Publishers and Broadcasters Association, where you know where that will be headquartered. We invite our viewers to join us via Facebook or Facebook page live and call us. When we get to that stage, you'll see the number come up on the screen, and I'll remind you when that time comes. We hope you stay with us over the next hour or so. Well, good evening to both of you.
Hi, good evening.
Let's start with you, Liz. What comes to your mind when you hear this term about non-violence, and non-violence begins with me? Before we get into non-violence, how we apply it to what we do in the media.
Well, I mean, immediately, of course, I think of myself as a journalist. And
I started saying that.
I know. Yes, exactly. But it immediately comes to mind that you have such a responsibility, I think, to, and that's not just as a journalist, but to be able to undermine what can cause violence. But that's very easy to say. But I think as a journalist, you are exposed to so many things, so many events where you see a lot of violence, or you see the results of violence. And it always used to make me think, you know, what caused this? And how can I help to avoid it? If you want to say, you know, it starts with me. I think everybody has it within their power to be non-violent. We also have it in our DNA to be violent. So it takes some development of skills. It takes some analysis of how you approach situations. And in many cases, it also takes a little bit of training to help to deconstruct why you do the things that you do, and give yourself some tools for how to approach something in a non-violent way. You know, conflict is natural. It's human relations, and it's not necessarily a negative thing. It is literally how you use the tools that you develop to de-escalate a situation.
All right, we'll come back and talk some more about those tools. But what's your opening take on it, Kira?
A very heavy burden that I cannot carry alone. That's the truth. I don't think that we should look at this as it is only me, while I have a big role to play. And when I think of me, I personalize it. So I don't think it's me just in my profession, but I think of my family life and my role as a mother in particular. I think of myself as a friend, as a sister, as a daughter. So I think in all of those aspects, the multiple roles I play helps define how I deal with that issue of nonviolence. I think that this is really a puzzle. And each of us has one of those pieces with what we can do. And we have to put all of those pieces together and work together with each other. And through that teamwork, then the culture will really start to change. I don't think it takes one person. It starts with one person, like a spark. It only takes a spark to get a fire going. But we need several sparks to really cause a blaze and do something about it. What also comes to my mind is one of those books, you know, when you're growing up, you read some books and they just are impactful and they last. And one of my favorites was a milestone in Christian literature, The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. And I remember the power of the word and the power of the word. the spoken word and the written word. And Andy, you're a literary person, so you must have read that book at some point.
Well, it's one of the all-time classics.
Yeah.
All the time.
And I think that also says a lot, because when I think of media and the impact we have, the influence we have, the power that we have, I really thought of that book when I saw this topic. And I said, you know, it reminds me so much of this journey that we are on, full with lots of challenges, lots of trials. But if we believe and we all work together, we will get to the ultimate destination.
Let me raise a practical issue that we deal with all the time. Sometimes we get criticized for it from different perspectives. A lot of people say that the media, by what we do, promote violence, because we cover that a lot, you know. And there's some dicta in media which says that if it bleeds, it leads, you know, and so the no news is good news, or good news is never
of
news.
Interest.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I really don't want to say that is true. And I don't think that it should ever be said that journalists contribute actively to violence, to the spread of violence. But I do think that unless you develop a strategy by which you understand the impact that those things have, and in a newsroom, be able to develop the balance between carrying the news competitively and understanding the impact that it has, then you can be contributing by failing not to report it as thoroughly as you should. And I mean, I suppose I remember when CCN first started.
Yes.
I remember there was an opening montage of all kinds of things happening in the news. And there was this shot of a man who chose to kill himself. He jumped out of a window, and the camera carried the shot all the way down. And I was reading the news at the time, and I would see this thing every single night. It was horrible. And I don't know what was the value of that, frankly. And eventually, I think we took it off. But, I mean, that was just a shot of violence, of somebody's absolute desperation of jumping out of a window, but out of context. You know, we didn't explain what was what happened. We didn't dig deeper to understand the context in which this man decided to take his life, but we showed it every night. I think that is an example of failing to expose the full issue. Suicide is a big problem. Depression is a big problem. We've seen that in the news recently. But the vision, the visual of seeing this man splat on the ground, what did that do? It didn't help the context at all. So I really think that I mean, we can talk about this in great detail, but the journalist has an important role to play in promoting nonviolence by exposing the causes of violence. And yes, if you don't do that, then perhaps we do play a role in promoting violence.
Yeah, I like to tell the story. Go ahead.
And I agree with that. I mean, and I remember when Newsday just started.
That is the point I was going to make.
Yeah. We come from that era, okay.
That's what they said.
Yeah.
Because there was this big debate in the country about the negativity in the press.
And that was Therese Mills, you know, who's not with us anymore. But I learned under her as a junior reporter, you know. And that was her vision, to have positive stories on that front page.
Yeah, and the first story, the founding story in Newsday was a story about 1,000 lives saved. I'll never forget it.
Yeah.
It was a kidney machine that had been put into the San
Yes, I remember that story.
Written by the now Dr. Chris Rampasad. Those things stay with me. But within 6 weeks, that whole paradigm changed.
Newsday was the newspaper with the two heads, yes, with the severed head on the front.
Yeah.
Well, you know, and as you were saying, and you know, people seem to like to want to go. Okay? Yeah. They say that
impact.
sells.
You were talking about impact.
So I asked, because that is always, for me being in media, that is always something you're at odds with. You know, does this really work? You know, why do we really have to do this? And in chatting with some friends who I consider influencers in their own way, I said, you know, why do you think that sells? They said, well, because it's taboo. Life is supposed to be normal and good. So those are the things that shake you up. And the opinion was, because that shakes you up is why it's probably important for it to be on the front page. Now, it's a perspective that I, may not have thought of, but that they felt was necessary because they said that in itself should be some form of advocacy for the powers that be to react and do something about it, especially when it comes to crime and violence. And I said, okay, I understand that point. I mean, it's something that we have to really consider.
And you have to do that on a daily basis because a lot, again, there are people who complain about, they're not seeing, they hear about a murder somewhere or a crime somewhere, and they're not seeing it in the paper, and they accuse us of ignoring it or burying it. A lot of times these things get...
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's
political.
a very, very valid point. And I think I want to go back to what I was saying at the beginning. I think that the journalist is not a peacemaker. That is not the role of a journalist. We are not there to mediate. But we have to find the balance. If that is what is happening in the country, that must be reported as far as I'm concerned. Maybe not in such gory detail, but perhaps you have to, because that is, it is a striking thing that's happening. The level of violence in this country is epidemic level, and that must be reported.
Okay.
But then what you really must do in a newsroom is to have the discussion about, are we covering it thoroughly enough? And what is the impact of that? Are we really digging enough, deeply enough, so that we can change it? What is our role in all of this? But it's not to cover it up.
Yeah, but I'll give you an example.
Gloss over.
I'll give you an example that is used as an international symbol of the journalist as a peacemaker. The late, great Walter Cronkite from CBS News, he is said to have advanced what was then called the Mideast peace process, where he asked Menachem Begin if he would have any problem meeting directly with Anwar Sadat. And Begin said yes. And that set in train, an episode that moved that process forward tremendously in that time. And so that's...
I completely agree. I think that, again, if you go back to the newsroom and you say, what is our role here? Do we have a role as promoting dialogue? And in doing that, I'm not going to create a platform for someone, but I can ask the kinds of questions that will expose them. And you know that they're using the media as a platform, because journalists have a level of access that other people may not. But they have to use that honestly and with balance. So if you go to one side and say, what do you think? And they use you as a platform and they rant and rave and they say, we hear a lot of that. We've heard a lot of that recently. Yeah. You have a responsibility to make sure that they're not just using you as a platform, and that you can zero in on what is the real interest that you need to expose, and then make sure that you go to the other side. So you create the dialogue.
Yeah.
Is there anything that is happening, amidst now that we could probably see how it might be better reported and explained from a position of trying to move past conflict? I mean, I left the radio station to come here, and there was a discussion about the chairman of Petrotrin and people wanting to take him to bits for saying what he said in relation to the fact that the industrial court has agreed to hear an injunction by the OWTU in this ongoing imbroglio involving the union and the workers and the board at Petrotrin.
Well, what I want to say is that I think the media also has a role to play in educating. And I think that is what it comes back to. I don't want to get into the current issue because we know how sensitive that issue is right now. And I don't want to form any opinions directly upon it. But I think that there are a lot of spin-off things that are not being considered that I think the media needs to bring to the fore. Tomorrow is Mental Health Day. I think we all know that.
In the town green,
there are things such as what happens when people are displaced. What are the effects when people are displaced? And you just mentioned things like suicide, Elizabeth. It is a very real situation. Domestic violence. What you find is that when people are under pressure generally, there is an upsurge in all of those matters. And we're talking about nonviolence starts with me. We have to realize what are some of the root causes of violence, particularly within families. And I think that amidst all of this, where is the human interest aspect of what is going on? And I think that has not been dealt with sufficiently. And it exists even within our school systems. An example is, I remember a situation some years ago. My son was going to school, I had to remove him. But there was a very bad situation where a student, committed suicide. And when I was trying to get information on, well, where are the counselors for this? I was told there was one counselor for 3 of the boys' schools in Port of Spain.
You mean one counselor each?
No,
one. Serving 3 schools.
Servicing 3 schools. Yeah. And I thought that was alarming. I said that could not be correct. And so when we talk of this issue, I think that stories like that, one, the media should probably have picked up on. That is insufficient. But I think it also shows a gap in our structure, in our social structure, where certain things are not being paid attention to. That is the larger issue. Are teachers being sufficiently trained to deal with the issues that are happening in the schools? Why is it that parenting is not the way parenting used to be? The solution to parenting is not to put your child in front of a television set or give them a smartphone or give them a smart tab, and why is it that we don't have more people getting involved in this area of social work? So when I started off, my opening talking about the pieces of a puzzle, those are the things that, came to me. Those are the things I was really referencing. And I think that through the media, there has to be that type of education as well. I think some of our media, I can see that they're trying, so you'll see that they pay attention to things like parenting segments or parenting information or how you deal with this. But I think there could be more, and I think it has to always come back to that linkage with what we are dealing with as a society currently. So yes, what is happening at Petrotrin, okay, yeah, but where's the human aspect of that? Have we really looked at that, and have we considered the effects it would have?
And what the human aspect has to do with trying to drill down into how workers will be affected and how their lives will change.
That's part of it. But Andy, you're a mediator. I think what Kieran is describing as a human aspect. If we go back to your question was about how can we look at an instance where if we reported on things differently, the conflict could be avoided or better understood. The human aspect that you talk about really is to look at what are the real interests behind the positions that are being articulated. What are the things that the union really needs to achieve, and the individuals that make up that union, and how is the closing down of the refinery really impacting on them, which influences their positions, but they don't articulate that. And so the journalist has a role to really dig underneath and say, well, they might be saying this, but these are the things that would really be happening. And you can do that on all sides. Just to take your point on human interest to another level also, I think one of the things that we don't pay attention to is human dignity. So in covering events, there is a responsibility, I think, on the media. And this goes to human rights, but the core of human rights is dignity. So if we covered things where we create, as media people, a checklist of how are we affected the dignity of this human being in the manner in which we're covering it, then you don't say, well, I'm not covering the event, but I'm covering it from a different perspective. And that, I think, also helps to reduce the conflict that can arise from how the issue is covered.
How do you think we are situated in Trinidad and Tobago media to do that? A lot of times you would hear, well, I'm saying us in this case sometimes because I've been in management positions for long enough that the resources aren't there to do those things.
And I think, I would like to think it's beginning to change. I know that, with TTPBA, we have been trying to change it. With Media Institute of the Caribbean, we've been trying to change it. You have to remember that a lot of the journalists who are in our newsrooms right now have probably not all had formal training in journalism. Let's start there. We started we started talking, Andy, about your career and how you started, and you said, you know, you were reading Time and Newsweek, and you were a literary and arts person. You weren't doing journalism, and so I think that we have to also be fair to the people in our newsroom, that they may not all be equipped with the skill set, which is where we're trying to pay some attention. I think that there has to be more interaction and dialogue and collaboration with middle management, senior management, and those journalists. I mean, that is how I feel, honestly. I mean, and my peers will tell you I say so to them all the time. And I think that understanding is beginning to happen, which is why some of the training that we have started to do, both at TTPBA and MIC level, you know, the journalists are being given the time off, and there's some recognition, but it is not an overnight change. This will not change overnight. It has to start, and I think it's starting. And I have to tell you that I am very impressed with a lot of the journalists in our newsroom. Like, I'm extremely impressed and proud of them. When you hear the eagerness and you see the extent to which they would go, you know, to get the stories. Time is important, and you can't just throw anybody in the newsroom either. And unfortunately for us, we have had, I think, maybe 2 decades where we have seen the passion for journalism decline. Even the ones who go through, say, CostStat, or, I mean, I remember TTPB was very active in formulating the first journalism degree at UE. They started with about 25 people registered, ended up with 6, and people went to go into PR, and, you know, because journalism is not about glamour and glitz. It's not about who's going to be in front of the television camera like Annie is right now. It's about where is your heart center and how hard do you want to work for this story. And journalists are always underpaid. I just want to make that point, right?
This is good.
A very good friend of mine, Jim Clancy, you know, Jim said, but they can't pay me enough to go into the war zone under threat of getting shot. And I've had to do that several times. And he made that point to the journalists. You have to have your heart in it. It's very much like a doctor, but it is a career. So I think that we are at a turning point in our landscape with all of the changes that we are undergoing, socially, technologically, where we are starting to see a new breed of journalists and a better understanding of media management for what needs to be done. But as I said, it's not an overnight process.
Yeah, and how do we bring, you know, the rest of the industry around that? And I suppose that's what you're talking about with the TTPBA and with this media institute in the Caribbean.
So and I think this is a good start. I think this is, you know, starting the discussion. This is where it starts, by having these kinds of discussions and interactions. And I was very happy to get the call and to come and to talk about this, because it's one of the areas that we think is very, very important.
But this industry being so super competitive, which is what caused the breaking up of that first paradigm for Newsday to where it is now. I like to quote the late Prime Minister, well, not late, former Prime Minister Pandey, saying that one day about Newsday. He said, you know, this is a newspaper that when it can't find a murder in Trinidad, it will go and find one in New York to put on the front page. And that was a headline one day in Newsday. The headline on the front page was 176 die. And what it was that somebody added up all the tragedies in the world that day, and it came up with that figure. People died in earthquakes and hurricanes and so on.
That's an approach. But, you know, this issue of the resources being the problem, I'm not sure that I agree. I think I agree completely that there is a responsibility at middle management level in a newsroom. I also think that there's some excellent journalists who are working now. I completely agree with that. But we keep deferring to saying, well, we don't have the money, we don't have the money. But that's not the issue that we're talking about here. What you're really talking about is that you have a tipping point of people in the industry, journalists, editors, cameramen, you know, everybody who have a way of thinking, who have reorganized their thoughts in a way that they're approaching their job with certain criteria. And that doesn't take money. That just takes somebody in a newsroom taking the responsibility to keep asking the questions, are we doing it right? And helping people to think things through until it becomes second nature. And the thing about conflict is that it is completely multidisciplinary. It is all kinds of things affected. So when you're talking about your types of training of journalists, why are we not also trying to partner with people who have specialties as psychologists to come and help the newsroom every now and then, explain the issue, or or the Dispute Resolution Center, for instance, that can train in mediation. That doesn't take money. Well, it takes some, of course, but it's not a huge outlay of resources.
It won't break the bank.
No, it doesn't break the bank, but it takes, the change is so gradual but significant that it's an important investment if you believe that it is important. Not if you're going to say, well, I need to it has to be done now, etc., etc. But you believe, as an editor, as a media owner, even as an individual, the I in this formula, that I need to start trying to do this differently, and the resources are there.
Yep.
And it can be done.
Yeah, no,
and we just have to have more and more people doing it in different sectors, and it will begin to become what you talked about at the very beginning, embedding a culture of nonviolence.
Yeah, and this is why I said, that's why I think these discussions were important to have, because this, dispute resolution is not something I would have really thought of at all until you were sitting here saying that to me. But I mean, and I think that is why we are where we are, and I think that is why the collaborations are significant. Mm-hmm. So, it is to have an open-mindedness. My concern is that journalism as a profession, we don't have enough young people coming into it, and I'm hoping that will start to change, because I think the more they can see the different angles, they can take the different shoes, they can wear, it gets them more excited about what could be done.
I wonder why that is. I mean, when I was young, I didn't want to do anything except be a journalist. Like, why is that? What do you think?
Well,
go ahead.
I think that we got hit by a lot of cable and media from the outside, and things started to become a lot more glamorous. And I mean, when you look at what has happened in the last 2 decades, it wasn't all about hardcore reporting. Although we had the CNN and the Fox and the ABC and everything, you had other options. And I think we have also started to push too much lawyer, engineer, doctor, marketing, different things that and journalism just wasn't one of them. I think that is where we have really fallen short.
And then a lot of people come into it as a stepping stone for other things, to go elsewhere and do other things.
Corporate communications, public relations. So even though they do mass communication, they seem to go that way. I have a problem with our school system in that I don't like that they drop the critical thinking. In our days we had to do critical thinking as a subject. And apparently that doesn't exist anymore. And to me, that is such an important subject, because that's where I developed a lot of my analytical skills as a 15 or 16-year-old. You start to look at things from all perspectives. So I mean, even with this topic, nonviolence starts with me. I think even in the school syllabus, we need to look at how is that topic being integrated? Are we giving the human mind sufficient room to understand and a learning ground to understand what it means and how to decipher certain things? In our home, I can tell you as a mother, my son did not have a smartphone until he was 16, not purchased by me, purchased by my mother, because his grandmother spoiled him, right? And there were certain television shows he was not allowed to look at. Plain and simple.
What is the level of resolve as a mother you had to have in order to insist that and to keep that at bay until you thought that he was ready?
It was very difficult. It was very difficult, especially when he has, he's spoiled by his aunts and his grandparents, and and his father think it's okay. But you have to do it. You have to say, listen, it's not good for you, and explain to him why. And that is where parenting becomes so important in this whole issue too of nonviolence begins, with me. As a parent, no matter how many hours you have, at your office, when you come home and you have that time with your child, you're supposed to sit and talk to them.
To what extent do you think that some of this discussion has to happen at the level of the decision makers in the media, in the particular media house, to change the orientation of the reporters, of the people in the newsroom, to change the approach to what we cover and how we cover it?
Absolutely. I think it has to happen at all levels. And if the vision from the top is one in which you think that my media house is one in which I can effect change. I mean, that's why you become a journalist, because you believe that your story is going to make a difference. And if the people at the top also believe that their media house has the power to make a difference, then the two will start to mesh. So I think that a lot of this dialogue has to happen. But again, I think at the top, middle, or bottom, people need to have the tools. And I think it's very often we don't know how we can make the change, but what are the things we need to do? What are the steps we need to take to change how we do things that could impact? We don't work those things out. And I think that's an important mechanism that we need to work out. We actually have to train ourselves.
Yeah, you think, Kiran, that training should involve, at least for some period, say, deciding that we won't have more than one murder on the front page for a week, or at the top of the news and radio and TV in the night?
Well, I mean, I think you have to remember we're in a plural society and there are many different opinions. I won't dictate to another media house what they should and shouldn't do, but I think once there is a sensitivity to what our responsibility is and what the possible repercussions are and what are the other angles that we can look at. I think once there's that sensitivity, then they can start making those decisions on their own. But to say that, we would come to an agreement of no more than one or two, I don't think that we could ask that. I don't even think it's possible, quite honestly. But I do think that there can be more interest and coverage of the other side of things. That I agree with. As Elizabeth said earlier, dig deeper, go beyond, ask the right things. And I think that is something that we could do.
And it will be the responsibility of individual media houses and the managers who run those places to decide that.
Yeah, essentially.
Sometimes you may have to bite a bullet and suffer some kind of fall off if you feel that is what is going to happen, because you're catering to an audience who is presumed to want certain things. But as you say, it's plurality, because there are some people who say now that they don't watch the news, they don't read the papers, they don't listen to the radio because there's too much negativity.
I'll give you an example as a media owner. One of my frequencies, Radio 90.5, is a East Indian frequency. We do Bollywood music. But I made a decision to not play chutney music. That was my decision, because I found it was lewd. I found some of it encouraged violence,
misogynistic.
And I decided not to play it. I know that my bottom line is not as pretty as some of the others who probably do it if I had done that. But that was my decision to make, because I wanted to be a family-oriented station. I wanted to create things that were positive, and we chose to do other things. I can't go to my competitor and say, why are you doing that? Because there are people who like that kind of music, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's an art form. But just for me, when I had to reformat, it was my decision, and that's the way I went. So that's what I mean by, you have to recognize, too, that there are people who will be interested in certain things, and you can't just throw those people aside to go with something that you think is probably better, because it's not Animal Farm.
Yeah. And as you say, but how do you reconcile what you say, the effect on your bottom line with that vision of wanting to create, I suppose, perpetuate a greater level of positiveness, of positivity?
I am very comfortable. I sleep very well at night. I'm very happy that people know us as the family station. It was never my desire to be number one. It was my desire to be number one with a certain group of people who had, just a different lifestyle from those, and that was my vision. So that's why I say it's really up to the media house and what their policies and visions are. But can they be influenced to look at it differently and to do more and dig deeper? Yes.
And what it takes to bring people around like that, you think, Liz?
To bring them to the point of not covering
Yeah, I'm not perpetuating violence in the way that it is seen to be.
Yeah,
So
I think it's a difficult call, frankly, because if you're motivated solely by the bottom line, then it's an easier decision. You know, no, I don't have to do that. I can simply have more good news. But that's not the reality, really. I think that if you're a genuine news agency, you have to report what's happening. And I'm not an advocate for pretending that that's not what's happening.
Yeah.
I think the balance is very important, not just the balance. And I think we do get that in many of our newspapers. We have lots of things being covered. You have women's issues, you have sports issues, but I think that the actual events of violence are not covered deeply enough, so that the context in which they happen is not the issue. What we cover is the event, and that is where we perpetuate the violence. I mean, there are many studies, of course, that say that the more people see violence, the less they are moved by it. Yeah. But I don't think that we can cover up that there is violence happening. I mean, I'm thinking, for instance, if you are you said a war reporter, bringing that level of visual impact to the rest of the world as to what is happening in Gaza, for instance, is very important. It's really, really powerful. And for the New York Times to say, I'm not covering that because it's too much violence, would be fundamentally wrong. Fundamentally. And so we really have to think through the balance, but make sure that it's not just wanton violence.
I give you two sort of anecdotes about how I've come to think about some of these things in the course of, my career. One was the invasion of Grenada in 1983, the U.S. invasion of Grenada, and some of the world's best were in Grenada for a couple of weeks, and I sort of were on the shoulders of some of them during those days. And I used to hear discussions about how some of them felt that they were in the wrong place. Nothing was happening there for to be exciting enough for them, and they were complaining, an invasion in which they had an issue with the fact that this small theater of conflict for them, 16 American boys were killed, and that was too much for them, And then in the case of Trinidad and Tobago, the great Kate Adie, who was working for ITV at the time, one night she was at the top of a building in Port-au-Spain during the attempted coup in 1990. And the next night, she was on top of a building in Kuwait, because that was where more action was happening. I'm saying that to say that I worked in newsrooms. I'm not sure if you all have the same kind of experience. On a Sunday, for instance, when nothing is happening, and you'll hear reporters say, well, why can't there be a good murder?
Yeah, but it's not just that. I mean, if you look at it from the perspective of the people involved in the conflict, for instance, I have a very good friend in Bosnia who we were talking the other day, and she was saying, you can't imagine how important it was for us to know that what was happening there was being covered outside. Because from inside, it looked like it was never going to end, and we had no power. So for that story to be covered in all its gore in another news media, in another news jurisdiction, was very, very important. So you can't just cover it up. But the depth of why this was happening and who was being affected and what was the possibility of changing it and creating a platform for the dialogue to happen between the U.S. and all the other players, like in Syria, all the multiple players who are involved, is where the media really plays a role in not perpetuating violence.
Right, and I imagine that, let me just remind our viewers, I imagine that the number would have been up on the screen now. We begin to take your calls and interact with us here on this discussion. Nonviolence begins with me. We're looking at how we apply that to the work of people in the media in Trinidad and Tobago. Do we think that, let's take the issue of coverage of political events and political meetings. People criticize it for the fact that a lot of times political parties are at each other's throats all the time. They, you know, they say the worst things about the other side all the time, and we run to that. You think probably we pay too much attention to the verbal attacks from one side to the other all the time?
That's a very good question, because of course people play to the media, and I do have the sense in Trinidad that the language with which we engage is contentious to an nth degree. It really is, and it's almost bordering on violent in many cases.
That's why I'm bringing it up.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm agreeing with you. And so we perpetuate it we run to it and we promote it and replay it and replay it. But there's responsibility on all sides, I think. So maybe we shouldn't. I agree. Maybe we shouldn't play it just because it's a great soundbite.
Somebody said something and then you
Yeah.
play it and then you go and ask the opposition. Well, what do you think about what he said? What's your response to what he said or what she said?
Well, you see, I have a little bit of a difference of opinion there. That maybe there should be a code of political conduct. Well, it exists.
There is, yes,
there is, but it's not legislated as it is in some other countries like India and I believe Australia and so on. But I mean, maybe that's one of the things we should be doing. And you see, this is my issue where I don't think you could. We have to understand our culture. So culturally, that is the kind of thing. If you want to say we're a mobile society or whatever, that is the kind of thing that it actually makes us laugh a lot. You know, apart from it being in the news. But to me, to fix that, then you have to wonder. Well, then, if these are our leaders, the politicians, and you're sitting here telling me they're spouting these things that they should not. You know, why are they spewing all of this? Then my thing should be, well, maybe there needs to be a code of political conduct. Maybe that will help, you know, all of them understand what is the role of a statesman or a stateswoman and so on. So to me, that is where the conversations probably need to go, and not, you know, should the media not be playing that? The media has played it. If there was a code and they were abiding by the code, we have no reason to play
I think both are possible. I mean,
yeah.
You can't legislate for culture change. You could put a code in place, but, you know, you really can't change
it has
the way that we engage by saying you're not allowed to do it, because...
Well, it has worked in other societies. We have to wonder why they're doing it. That's why I said no change overnight.
In other societies, and those societies are as free and unrestrained and unregulated as ours?
I think so, yeah. I think so.
You mean Singapore and Cuba and places like that?
I was thinking of India, actually. I was thinking of India, and I think that their prime minister right now is doing an excellent job, you know, and I look at what has happened there, because that was one of the cases we used when we were doing the Code of Political Conduct, the civil society.
Well, there's been a lot of violence around.
There has been violence, but I mean, in terms
statements that he's made.
You mean so he's standing out as a kind of standout? He's trying to move away from the culture of Indian politics. I mean, they kill politicians in India, you know, and they pelt shoes at one of them kind of things in the parliaments, in the Lok Sabha, they call it. And so maybe he's trying a different route, a different tack.
Maybe, but I mean, the thing is, they do have a code. And, you know, and if we're talking about, you know, what is being said on political platforms and how politicians speak, then I think that's where the conversation is.
Well, I think the question is not, it is the impact that they have. I mean, is it a contentious way of engaging, or is it not? And so, I mean, the code of conduct is one thing, but what is the impact of repeating over and over again this tone and this anger on how violence is caused in the society? You know, it alienates people, and as a result, people feel that their only way of reacting is to lash out. So it has a spin-off effect. Where does the media support the carry-on of that? Yeah. is part of the question.
And I think the media houses do it to varying degrees.
But maybe they haven't even thought it through, you know?
Yeah.
And I agree with you that the responsibility lies with the person who makes the utterance in the first place. But, you know, the question is, what is the impact on violence? It's not just, okay, you can't shout and scream, but we haven't understood how that kind of methodology of engaging impacts on how people feel and then how they react. And then, you know, we haven't done that analysis. And we're not doing it.
And violence, in a lot of respects, in these cases, involve people saying things injurious to someone else.
Yes.
And denigrating.
Yeah. Whole groups, whole groups of people, the hotspot, and everybody is in one fell swoop is marginalized and discredited as being part of the national dialogue or deserving of being, recipients of the goodwill of some speaker or not.
Yeah, so
and that is very powerful.
So there's another part of the puzzle, another piece of the puzzle is the leaders,
What would be your response to the coverage of the incident in which these young men in Beetham kicked water in the face of the MP and the minister?
The coverage of it?
Yeah.
That's an interesting one because I think it was an important thing to cover. I'm sure that the MP was not pleased at all. But the fact of that community reacting that way to such an MP was definitely a news story. To me, I read it as a sign of real discontent. Not just, being unhappy, but there's something really not right. Or is it that somebody was feeding this? So I think it needed more investigation. We kept covering the event, but we never looked behind how many people were actually there. Why did they feel marginalized? What were they angry about? There was some talk about yellow shirts. Was that really true? I think there was more that could have been done.
Yeah, well, there were in fact yellow shirts, but the question is who promoted that, and that became part of the narrative that those youths who did that, were paid to do it, or were agents of the yellow shirts
did we get to the bottom of it?
And that's the question.
Yeah.
Like
to what extent it was.
This group Bellingcat, that they that have been digging and digging to find out who were these men who the Russians who were said to be related to
the Novichok poisoning.
They have not let go of that story, and they're digging deeper and deeper, and it's an important thing to do.
Yeah, well, they defined the fellas as in fact Russian intelligence agents who worked and were highly decorated.
So they're going way beyond the event, much deeper, and I think that is what we need to do, to understand more.
How do we begin to get there, Kiran, you think?
Well, as I said, I think training and getting the journalists to understand, how to do that
conflict
deep dive,
analysis.
I think is very important. So it's not just the conflict analysis, but what are the questions that need to be asked? And we have been doing that we've started to do. TTPB and MIC, we've done things like investigative reporting, the art of the investigative story, and we'll be continuing to do that kind of training. So definitely there is recognition, I think, by the media owners, and the editors and producers that they need that kind of thing, and that is why they're willing to let the journalists, take the time off to go to do some of this. But training is very important because, as we said before, a lot of them probably have not had that formal training, and they need to have it. So training is very important. The educational aspect is very important. I think, too, that more and more within the tertiary school system, there needs to be more acknowledgement of how the stories are dealt with. I think that is not being done sufficiently, in that they get all of the textbook information, but then when you actually go into a newsroom or go into that environment, here's reality.
It's a different thing,
it hits you, and what do you have to do here? And I guess that harkens back to what Elizabeth was saying, was that, how you interact with people and get these stories out. So I think that training and development is very important. I think that a recognition, too, that while it is the media, and the media has a large role to play in this, it is the citizens, the consumers of media, the listeners, the viewers, the readers, need to also understand that they, too, have a role to play in all of this. So sometimes we see those things come through, the letters to the editor or the comments now on the social media. It's a good thing, I think, that our traditional media has been integrated with our social media platforms. And I think that as citizens, we too have to spur some of, the comments and the information and ask too for some of those angles. It may be something that has not occurred to a journalist or to the editor or producer of a show. And that's how it has to go.
What do you think about, what are your concerns about the way in which traditional media has integrated or sought to integrate with social media? Because everybody wants to be first with everything that comes on Facebook or Twitter, and sometimes unchecked, unfiltered, and that is a kind of violence in itself. What you do to the professional, what you do to people's senses by trying to get out there a lot of times.
I have to tell you, it has improved so greatly in the last maybe year or so. I've been paying attention. I know that with all of our media houses, they actually have people who have been paying attention now to what is posted, and they try to remove it as quickly as they could, and they do try to filter it. I think it has gotten a lot better because I think we're starting to realize the impact it could have. So I think that we are on the right road as far as that goes right now. Facebook is a whole other monster.
Are we on Facebook now?
But I did see a very interesting documentary on Al Jazeera on Facebook. Everybody should see that. But I mean, they talked about, and this is media, it's not our media, but it's our media because we have access to it, And I think that we have to understand there are a lot of evils with Facebook. And I did not realize it until that documentary, the kinds of videos that are actually kept up and what their criteria is for removing some of the videos and the information. It was very, very alarming. And I want to appeal especially to parents because children spend a lot of time on Facebook. They could all lie about their date of birth and they get a Facebook account, to pay attention to what is happening and what is coming into your home, onto that child's phone or the tablet or the computer that they use for school.
Yeah. I'll go back to the Beetham issue. Not that I'm picking on the community or anybody there, but using it as a reference point to talk about some of what we're talking about here. Perhaps if the issue was reported without the video showing what actually happened, you think it would have made a difference? Or that the story had to go with the visuals, as they say?
I think the visuals was the reality check.
I don't know why you would report it without the visuals. I mean, I think it was part of of what happened.
Yeah, but I mean, to talk about, well, in the context of what we're talking about here, whether it would have made a difference in conveying what was...
I think the only thing that would have made a difference is deeper reporting, frankly. I don't think that it is our role as media people to try and check ourselves so much that you're not showing what is actually happening. The visuals were there, and it was quite powerful. It told a very powerful story, but you have a responsibility to understand it better and to analyze it more with a conflict lens. And that's why I think this, added to what you're saying in terms of training and investigative reporting or whatever, I would make a real plug for mediation skills training, because that gives you the tools that you need to analyze and to interact in a different way. It changes the way that you engage. I mean, as I say, Andy's a mediator. He was trained with the Dispute Resolution Center, if I'm not mistaken. I think that and it's not just mediation training, but conflict analysis training. There is a need to develop a toolkit as a journalist and as a media person. So to take what you've learned and to give yourself, I keep calling it a checklist, but to give yourself the mechanisms in order to analyze things better, and to say to yourself, I'm not doing this story justice unless I have dug down deeper and understood what you described as the human interest, but also and I've paid respect to the human dignity of the people involved, and I've really understood this. And I don't have to understand it in this first story, but I'm covering more than just the event. I think that would make a difference, more than, not showing the visuals.
But that the decision makers in the newsroom have to allow for that, and therefore
they have to demand it.
A kind of reorientation.
I think they have to demand it, and they have to require of their journalists that they do that. But I think that requires an editor, for instance, gathering people around when you're doing the assignments in the morning and saying, you know, have we covered this from all the angles? Because that's how the newsroom hierarchy works. The editor is the one who gives the guidance and you know, and it is in that dialogue where ideas are born and you know, but if we're all demanding that of each other in that context, you're going to perform much better, and there you can begin to see that you are impacting on nonviolence.
Yeah, and that means sometimes staying with an issue rather than what we have the appetite for just moving on to, you know, the next thrill.
Yep.
A lot of times
Exactly.
because we believe that is what our audiences want. Because, you know, and it is a fact to some extent. You know, I can't tell you the number of times, you know, you would stay with an issue and try, as you say, to get behind it and find the angles that need to be explained. And there are people in the audience who would say, "You still with that boy? You still covering that?"
Yeah. There's an advertisement that what is this guy on CNN, the white-haired
Anderson Cooper.
Yes. There's an advertisement with Anderson Cooper where, you know, there are many advertisements on CNN, etc. But there's one in particular where he says, "I can't just parachute in and hope to get a story from people. I owe them to tell their story fully." And that really resonates, I think, in terms of making sure that you really do it justice. It's not for you or for CNN. It's a story.
And the trick in there is that he's saying that, but he does that. But the question is, how is he prepared so that every time he gets parachuted in a story, he knows how to.
He can engage.
He can approach
exactly.
it,
Right. That's just the point, yeah.
So where do you go from here? Where you think we ought to be going from here? If we were to use this discussion as a template for going forward and trying to reorient ourselves in terms of, you know, moving out of the preoccupation with blood and gore and
training.
I think education and training. I think education of the population and all the other pieces, the leaders, the teachers, you know, the people responsible for building curriculums at schools, parents. And I think training definitely within the media houses, within the tertiary level institutions where our new journalists are coming from. I think that is very important. A recognition that if we want to really make a change, we have to be all-encompassing and work together to do it. I think that is where it has to start.
And we haven't talked about, which is a big issue as well, and putting it in that mix here, bullying in schools, which seems to just be on the increase.
You know, I did a series of discussions in schools around Trinidad on conflict prevention and mediation, and I was shocked at the number of young people who have been exposed to violence at such a profound level that they really don't have the mechanism. So I did this game where they had to fight, they had to negotiate with me, two teams, to get something that I had that only I had in the world, and it was going to impact both sides. And in every single instance, they came to me and they said, "Miss, sorry, but I'm going to have to kill you for it." Every time. That is a
they
really...
have to do what?
Kill me for it. They could not come up with a solution until, you know, I had to talk them through it. But that is a real indictment on the skill set that we have as individuals in dealing with conflict situations.
But you see, and this is why the parenting becomes important. What happens in the schools with the school teachers?
Some of these people don't have parents.
So
I mean, and that's another thing. We keep talking about family in a particular context, and that alienates people.
You said some of these schools don't have parents?
Some of the children did not have necessarily parents, or you know, they had lost their parents to violence.
But then the teachers become important. Because
the teachers were important. They brought me in because they saw a need in that context. So it's a lot.
And in some cases, it's endemic. I have a granddaughter who she just left her high school a year or two ago, and she said that when she was leaving, 25 boys, she checked, who were killed from that school.
Yeah.
But I'm afraid that's where we have to leave it. Kiran Maharaj and Elizabeth Solomon. We've been talking about violence in the media. I'm Andy Johnson. Thanks for watching.